Hi, my name's Andrew Burlingame, and I'm the Assistant Professor of Hebrew in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages at Wheaton College.
Dr. Burlingame, Drew, good to see you, my friend. Thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
Good to see you. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I miss Wheaton College. I'm looking forward to the next time I can get up there. We were trying to do it this year, but it didn't quite work out. Maybe over the summer or hopefully this fall. I know you guys are moving into new space there.
That's right. Yeah, we're moving out of Weingarten, which was the home for our department for 40 years.
40
Uh,
years. Wow.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, we're moving into McAllister Hall, which was previously the Music Conservatory. We're going to have a lot of great space for students to collaborate and spend more time together. We're excited about it.
And you've got a big office now, which is great.
It's bigger.
Hopefully it'll hold all of your books. All right, today we're going to talk about Second Kings chapter 1. A lot is going on in that chapter. Really interesting chapter. The transition between 1 Kings to 2 and such. Tell us what's going on in Second Kings chapter 1.
Yeah, well, in the book of Second Kings, as we move into chapter 2, we get the kind of the famous scene where Elijah is taken up into heaven in the fiery chariot. But in chapter 1, we really get what is his swan song. So if you think about Elijah's ministry as one of opposing the sponsorship of the Omride dynasty of Baal worship in Israel, this is his last face-off with an Omride king. The king in question is Ahaziah or Ahaziah. He's the son of Ahab. And this is kind of the last face-off that Elijah has with one of these kings concerning devotion to Baal in Israel before he exits and Elisha assumes his mantle of ministry.
And the Omride dynasty was just full of bad kings.
Right. So this is Omri and Ahab, the queen Jezebel, some of these famous characters who are Elijah's primary antagonists.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, all right. Ahaziah has a bit of an accident, it seems, in Second Kings 1.
Yeah, so in chapter 1, the story begins with Ahaziah falling through a lattice in the upper story of his residence. He's badly injured. He sends messengers to the Baal of Ekron to ask whether he'll survive. And meanwhile, the Lord sends Elijah to go intercept these messengers with a message of judgment. He says, "Is there no God in Israel that you have to go ask the Baal of Ekron whether you'll survive? Here's the message. The bed that you've gone up onto, that is your sick bed, you're not coming down from it. You're going to die." The messengers bring this message back to Ahaziah, and he says, "Well, what did the guy look like? What did the prophet look like?" And they describe him that he was a hairy man with a leather belt, and he says, "I knew it. It was Elijah." And so he sends a contingency of 50 soldiers out to bring Elijah in. And the narrator specifies that as they go out to Elijah, they approach him, and he's sitting on top of a tall hill or a mountain. The word here is har in Hebrew. It's the word that's typically used to describe a mountain. He's sitting up on top of this. And so the soldiers come to the foot of the mountain, and they call to him, and they say, "Man of God, the king says, come down." And he says, "If I'm a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50." And it does. So Ahaziah does the logical thing and sends 50 more soldiers. And they too come to the foot of the mountain and say, "Man of God, hear the word of the king. Come down right away." And he says, "If I'm a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your soldiers." And it does. Ahaziah sends a third contingent, and this time the final captain knows what's happened to the preceding two, and he approaches the mountain. He falls on his knees and he says, "Spare our lives. We know what's going on." And the angel of the Lord speaks to Elijah and tells him to go down with this captain. He goes down. He pronounces his word of judgment on Ahaziah, and Ahaziah dies, and the narrative concludes.
Mm.
So that's the kind of the setup here. And what I'm interested in discussing is an interesting case of wordplay and typecasting that hinges on Elijah's position here on top of this mountain as the soldiers.
On top of the har, as it were.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. So, what is that kind of wordplay? Because I love these wordplays in Hebrew. These are things you cannot get in translation.
No, you're right. And in fact, we read this text as part of an upper division Hebrew reading class this spring. We were reading Second Kings in Hebrew along with some other related texts. And in this instance, what we miss when we read in translation is that there's a play on words between what the soldiers are saying to Elijah and the response that he's giving. So they come out to him and they refer to him as a man of God, and the Hebrew expression is Ish Elohim. So Ish is the word for man. And Elijah's response is, "If I'm an Ish Elohim, then let Aish, fire, fall down from heaven and consume you." Or come down, I should say, from heaven and consume you. In other words, they say, Ish Elohim, come down. And he says, let Aish come down. And in fact, in verse 12, the narrator even takes it a step farther and cements the pun for us and describes how Aish Elohim, that is fire of God, fell down or came down and consumed these soldiers. So it's as if they've come to the mountain saying,
Mm.
Ish Elohim, come down. And he says, Aish Elohim, fire of God is headed your way. There's a play on words that
Whoa.
creates a sort of literary sense of balance between the offense and the punishment that
Mm.
we don't detect in the narrative otherwise.
Yeah. This is one of the brilliant things about Hebrew that you don't get ever in translation. So Ish Elohim becomes Aish Elohim, the fire of God. And that play between Ish, the man, and Aish, fire, is really brilliant there.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, the use of the word to descend that Elijah says, so he says, let fire come down from heaven using the verb yarad, which is to come down or to descend. It's different from the verb that we see in 1 Kings 18 when he calls fire down on the sacrifice on
Mm.
Mount Carmel. So there we get the word nafal. It says fire fell from heaven. Here we get a different word so that the balance between what the soldiers are saying and what Elijah is responding is actually quite a bit stronger.
Yeah. That's a really cool reading of that text to see that. I mean, that literary balance with that. So, is this kind of an aspect of literary criticism, linguistic? I mean, how would you characterize this kind of reading?
It's a bit of both. The narratives that we come to in First and Second Kings, especially these stories about Elijah and Elisha, are they're just full of literary artistry. There's a lot of wordplay and allusion and characterization that we miss when we read it in translation in some cases. And in fact, this one I think provides another example of that. So I mentioned this characterization or typecasting. By putting Elijah on top of this mountain and giving him the opportunity to call fire down from heaven, which is probably lightning, on each of these contingents of soldiers, Elijah is really being cast as a sort of Baal, right? Baal is the storm god and quintessentially sits on top of a mountain throwing lightning bolts at his enemies. And so I think that in some ways, in this swan song of Elijah, we see a final flourish added to the polemic against Omride sponsorship of Baal worship that's characterized a lot of the narratives about his ministry. So if you think about 1 Kings 18 with the contest between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, the whole contest hinges on the question not just of who is God in Israel, is it Yahweh or Baal, but really who's the better storm god? Is it Yahweh or Baal? Right? The contest is set up on top of a mountain where Baal is supposed to dwell. It's right on the edge of Phoenician territory where Baal is venerated. And the whole point of the contest is which god can send lightning. And this is something the storm god is quintessentially supposed to do. So Baal has every home court advantage imaginable.
Yeah.
And Yahweh shows that, in fact, he's the better storm god. And in fact, here in this final episode in Elijah's ministry, we see that not only is Yahweh a more formidable storm god than Baal, but even Yahweh's prophet turns out to be a better Baal than Baal, right? So
That's
Ahaziah
great.
sends servants to the Baal of Ekron to get an answer.
Yeah.
And we close this narrative with the prophet of Yahweh sitting on a mountain throwing lightning bolts at his enemies, so to
Yeah.
speak.
And he comes down to pronounce a word of judgment against the king. And that is
Yeah.
that the end of the Omride dynasty then?
Uh, Not quite. We get to deal with them a bit further in the narrative.
But it still puts kind of an umbrella over the whole of the dynasty, doesn't it? And just
Yeah.
says this whole thing has been corrupt and contingent upon Baal and the whole time.
Yeah. So I think it provides a fitting conclusion to Elijah's ministry in terms of where the narrator has been going.
Excellent, excellent. Dr. Drew Burlingame, thank you so much for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
Thanks for having me, David.
What a great conversation. I hope you agree. Now, there's only 168 hours until the next podcast drops, so watch for it. Subscribe to this podcast, rate us today. If you want to study biblical languages, you need to consider Wheaton College. They have the best program in the country, bar none. Go to wheaton.edu, look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. Come on, you know you want to. Thanks for those who make this podcast possible. John Lonsma is our Wheaton-based director, Ian Rosine, and Rebecca Larson. Thanks to Phil Keggy for our music. Until next time, thanks for listening.